Bible in a minute, Joshua chapter 1. Joshua 1 is three things. It is a transfer of authority from Moses to Joshua. It is a brief masterclass on what does it mean to be an Israelite. And it's a pep talk for war. Joshua 1 gives us this wonderful verse, be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. The Lord will be with you wherever you go. What a beautiful scripture. People quote that scripture in politics, when facing health scares, when facing addiction, abuse. We use it all the time. So what does it mean that a pep talk meant for a violent conquest thousands of years ago is still so useful to us today in our daily lives? Be strong and courageous.
Joshua 2. In this chapter, we find Rahab, who's a Canaanite Gentile woman and also a sex worker, harboring two ancient Israelite spies. I love this chapter because it's filled with interest and intrigue. In fact, James Bond has nothing on Joshua 2. Rahab then makes a deal with these ancient spies to ensure that when they come back into the land to slaughter the people who already live there and reclaim the land, which is incredibly morally troubling, that Rahab and her family will be spared. Now, the purpose of this story is to show that someone who is marginalized is elevated to hero status in God's story. In fact, Rahab is so significant that in Matthew's genealogy of Jesus, she is listed as one of Jesus' most significant ancestors. Our role today is to ensure that marginalized voices like those of Rahab are elevated.
Joshua chapter 3. Let's part some waters again, shall we? In this chapter, it's Joshua who is leading the people. They camp at the river Jordan before making their cross to the other side. The priests tell them to follow the Ark of the Covenant because they do not know where they are going. Joshua turns to the people and says, get ready because you ain't seen nothing yet. As the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant reach the overflowing banks of the Jordan River and place their feet in the water collects in a heap and the people are able to cross on dry land. No stretched arms, no grand gestures, just standing still. Now, I don't know exactly what a heap of water looks like, but I love how this passage reminds us that sometimes all we need to do to see God at work is stand still. Oh Lord, may we stand still long enough to bear witness to your work in this world and in our lives. Amen.
Joshua chapter 4. Don't you worry your pretty little mind. People throw rocks at things that shine. When pop star theologian Taylor Swift penned these words, she wasn't thinking of this chapter from Joshua where stones were placed to honor something extraordinary. Yet I can't help but associate Swift's connection between stones and that which is brilliant, especially when considering the instructions given to Joshua when crossing into the Promised Land. Stones placed as markers for future generations, telling them that something brilliant, something dazzling, something that stood out in the story of these people happened in this place. Placing stones has long held meaningful symbolism, evoking a sense of the holy in a place, a marker of gratitude for what was accomplished. What better way for the Israelite people to acknowledge their journey? What better way to leave witness for future generations of God's presence in this historical moment? When we pick up our stones, may the holy history within them be a reminder of those who've gone before, and when we place them down again, may they symbolize for us all the ways in which God makes our journey shine.
Joshua 5 with a focus on foreskins. So the Israeli army is continuing on, and in order to demonstrate their ongoing commitment to God, they're chopping off the foreskins of anyone left who's got one and piling them all up in a hill, saying, this is the hill of the foreskins. Tell your kids we're coming back here. Then, as they keep going, they meet an angel who they thought was actually an officer, but it turns out it's an angel who said, take off your shoes. This is holy ground. And so they did. And that's Josh 5. Now, as an aside, this chapter is interesting, especially as one who is into reproductive justice. In this day and age, I'm all about creating people with possibility for folks to choose about themselves and in conversation with God, what to do with all the bits and pieces of their bodies, how to alter their own selves in conversation with God. So, some challenge here, but ultimately what we're left with is a hill of foreskins.
Joshua chapter 6. Does God love money and weapons more than the lives of humans and animals? Because in this chapter, the answer seems to be yes. It's the whole Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho story. The one where the walls came tumbling down. Or if you grew up in the VeggieTales era,
keep walking, but you will not knock down our walls.
When the walls do come down after 7 days and 13 laps around the city, the army devoted to destruction by the edge of the sword, all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. That's a direct quote from verse 21. But all that silver and gold and bronze and iron, save that stuff, because they are sacred to the Lord. They shall go into the treasury of the Lord. Wait, why are bronze and iron sacred? Because that's what you use to make weapons. This story likely takes place toward the end of the Bronze Age and just before the beginning of the Iron Age, so the world was in the midst of a weapons revolution, with the stronger iron weapons massacring anyone wearing that wimpy bronze stuff. So yeah, in this story, God seems to love money and weapons more than the lives of humans and animals. But they didn't teach you that part in Sunday school.
Joshua chapter 7. In this chapter, we have the battle at Ai, which was supposed to be a very easy victory. It did, however, end in defeat. After praying, Joshua discovers that someone in the camp had plundered goods. It was discovered that Achan had taken goods from the city and buried them under his tent. Joshua orders Achan all the goods that were plundered and Achan's entire family to the valley of Achor, where Achan and his family were put to death. Would God order someone to take over someone else's land? Would God order the stoning of someone because they had stolen goods? To me, whether you're taking over land or stealing goods from that land, it seems to be the same thing, and neither should end in stoning.
Joshua chapter 8. In this chapter, you see statements from God instructing Joshua to take the land and its resources. And then Joshua and the author repeating these statements from God as divine justification for the destruction and pillaging of the city of Ai. Then at the end of the chapter, a covenant renewal ceremony takes place. The same ceremony that was described at the end of Deuteronomy, where the Hebrew people commit to following God and God's commandments, which include, you shall not murder and you shall not steal. Now, the destruction of Ai and Jericho are just a couple of many examples of religiously sanctioned violence that has happened throughout history, where entire communities have been killed and their land and resources stolen. This systematic pillaging and indiscriminate murder of tens of thousands of people, plainly put, is genocide. It happened then and it continues to happen today. Make it make sense. Would this really be what God wants?
Joshua chapter 9. War. That's the context of this chapter. Occupation is the context of this chapter. And so Joshua has been leading the Israelites all through the land of Canaan, conquering and occupying the land. And so now nations within the land have decided to come together, to come and meet Joshua and to fight him and the Israelites to keep them from further conquering the land. But there's one particular group from Gibeon who decides that they would rather trick Joshua, serve under Joshua, and rather than risk their lives, serve as slaves rather than fighting against Joshua. So to me, the question is this: is it better to keep your life and to serve as a slave, or to risk your life by fighting for your freedom?
Joshua chapter 10. Ooh, is this one a nice Sunday school story? Let's see. The king of Jerusalem calls his 4 friends. They all gang up on Gibeon, who you might remember from chapter 9 had just agreed to be Joshua's slaves so long as Joshua would protect them. Oh yeah, the Gibeonites. Well, now they need protection. Typical Gibeonites. So Joshua and his army head south. God literally throws rocks from the sky. No, really? Yeah, that's what it says. Sounds more like Zeus and his lightning bolts. Oh, and then the moon and sun stand still. How is that even possible? I don't know, but somehow it helps them kill everyone. Of course it does. And then they chase the 5 kings into a cave, roll large stones against the entrance, go kill everyone in their cities, then come back, bring out the kings, and kill them. Wait, this is in the Bible? Don't we give this book to kids? And in that part about the sun and the moon standing still, there's this reference to the book of Jashar, which is not even in the Bible. Wait, what?
Joshua chapter 11. In this chapter, we see Joshua finally seizing the promised land on behalf of the Israelites after the death of Moses. Verse 23, so Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses, and Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel. Here we have to wrestle with the idea of God condoning war, God condoning the murder of a whole people. Do we think God really told Joshua and his people to kill everyone in that land? Or is this a story that we should look back on and grieve because of the death of the Canaanites at the hand of the Israelites, because of their misunderstanding of what God wanted them to do? The scriptures tell us a story of people trying to do what God tells them to do, but sometimes God's people got it wrong.
Joshua chapter 12. This chapter serves as a concluding chapter before a major division break in the first half and the second half of the book of Joshua. This chapter gives us a summary of the career of Moses and the Israelites defeating a couple of kings on the east side of the Jordan River. And then Joshua and the Israelites cross over, they enter the west side of the Jordan River, and they defeat a bunch of kings. You've got a list of 31 cities. The city of Bethel is listed twice, which shows its future importance in the history of Israel. We get a conclusion to the story of the Nephilim, introduced in Genesis chapter 6, with Moses and the Israelites defeating King Og, the last of the Rephaim, which are the descendants of the Nephilim. As a literary whole, Joshua 12 serves as this big summary of all that has happened already, pointing towards what is to come.
Joshua chapter 13. In this chapter, Joshua is old and is giving the land that he has been a part of conquering to different groups of people as their inheritance, as if it was his land to give. So now he's giving this land over to whoever will occupy it for the time to come. But the Levites were given nothing, because their inheritance was to be given a calling, a vocation of responsibility to be the priests among the people. So Joshua 13 shows us that, just like Anna said in Frozen, some things never change, that people have a tendency to lay claim to a land, but is land ever to be owned? Didn't God give humans the task of being stewards of the land, of letting the land speak for itself?
Joshua chapter 14. It's time to divvy up the land on the west side of the Jordan River, and buckle up because we're going to be doing this for the next 6 chapters. Now here in this one, we're really just focused on Caleb, who we first met way back in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. He was one of the original spies to go into the land and check things out, and while most of that original crew were freaked out by all the people they saw, what, did they expect it to just be empty and waiting for them to build their settlements? Now Caleb, back then, he was ready to lead the charge and kick everyone out. And so now, 45 years later, Caleb is still around and making his claim for the land he scouted out all those decades ago. And Joshua says, okay, it's all yours. I wonder how this 85-year-old warrior will fare when it comes time to lead the charge all these years later. Oh, hey, look, we're going to find out in the next chapter.
Joshua chapter 15. Here we see the division of land among the tribe and the people of Judah. But in a classic form, in classic colonialism, some receive better land, others receive less. Others still have to beg for resources in order to farm and live on the land that they receive. And lest we be mistaken, this is land that is still being fought over this very day. At this very day, this very hour, this same land is being bombed. And people living on this land are being forced off it. This chapter speaks to the dangers of colonialism, the dangers to the earth, the dangers to people, the dangers to humanity.
Joshua 16, and we are still handing out land. But this time, it's Ephraim's turn. Ephraim, a descendant of Joseph. You gotta remember the story of Joseph, though. You know, the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Brothers sell him into slavery, and he goes from slave to prisoner to second most powerful person in Egypt. And he ends up saving everyone's lives when there is a grand famine. But of course, they end up as slaves. Welcome to the book of Exodus. And now in Joshua 16, this tribe of former slaves is taking someone else's land. And look at that last verse. They don't even kick out all the Canaanites. Oh, that's kind of nice, right? Oh wait, they let them live in Gezer so that they can force them to do labor for them. These former slaves now have slaves.
Joshua chapter 17. In this chapter, we see various dynamics of power at play, and whenever power, property, and possessions are at play, conflict is usually close at hand. First, the 5 daughters of Zelophehad, who we read about in Numbers chapter 27, remind the leaders of the promise made to them after petitioning Moses that the inheritance from their fathers should be given to them. This new practice provides property and power to the female descendants of a father with no sons, rather than distributing it solely to the male extended family members. Second, the tribes believed they were divinely appointed to live in those lands, and in order to inhabit them, they drove out the people who already lived there. They killed them or enslaved them, and they stripped the power away from the indigenous people who were living there. For those of us considering these writings today, it's helpful for us to be mindful of the power and privilege we assume, and the effect that it has on those around us. What may seem good for us may be disastrous for others.
Joshua 18. Shiloh. There is a portrait of national unity. The larger tribes are there. They have not departed. The whole congregation has assembled. The purpose is to finish the allotment to the 7 remaining tribes in the north, the smaller tribes. But first, a rebuke. Joshua asks, "What are you waiting for? Go take possession of the land that God has given you." But they are slack. Joshua says, "Gather 3 men from each tribe to go out and survey the land. Write a description. Report back." Joshua then casts lots in the presence of God. And then we get the inheritance of Benjamin as told in 11 through 28. Benjamin's territory lies between Judah and Ephraim, a kind of no man's land between what would later become the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So Benjamin is described by its relevance for Judah.
Joshua 19. I don't know why everyone gives the book of Numbers such a hard time when this chapter is exactly as interesting as looking at a map. Joshua 19 is the second half of an instance where Joshua has commissioned the remaining 7 tribes of Israel to divide up the land amongst them. Benjamin gets his own chapter in Joshua 18, and then 19 contains the territory being given to the other brothers, and finally by default Joshua, who's done so much for Israel as a whole. Now again, this chapter could serve as a good ASMR podcast to get me to sleep, but there is something worth noting here, and it's the repetitive focus on equity. Each tribe is distributed land fairly and equally as determined by its size. Now, maybe it's just me here in America where I can probably never afford to sell my house and move, but I could certainly hear more about equity and appropriate sharing of land. Joshua even sets up a form of biblical leadership that we could learn quite a bit from, doing all the land distribution in the sight of others who have already done that surveying, in the sight of God and the community, and also by randomized casting of lots. By golly, it sounds almost like Comrade Joshua is trying to make things equal for everyone. What a neat biblical idea.
Joshua chapter 20. The law of Moses said murderers would be put to death, but what about deaths that happen accidentally, unintentionally? For those deaths, God set up 6 cities of refuge, places of safety and atonement. You didn't get a pass for killing anybody there, but it did buy you some time. The catch is, you couldn't leave. If you were found anywhere outside the gates of the city of refuge, blood vengeance or payback was completely allowed. I know you're wondering about the atonement. How did that work? Glad you asked. At the death of the high priest of the city, the killer was set free. It was believed that the death of a righteous person, like the high priest, made up for the killer's terrible deed. Of course, we Christians later found atonement in the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, but it's pretty amazing that ordinary folks could do this for one another back in the day before Jesus came on the scene. While I'm not advocating anyone's death, I am wondering how our lives might set someone else free.
Joshua 21. This chapter arises so many biblical and theological questions for me. See, the issue with Joshua 21 is that it states that Joshua and the Israelites were supposed to be given all of the land due to them by Yahweh. Yet in the other previous chapters, we see that they are called to possess and take over the land. And then what do we do with the Levites as they are called the assistants to the priests of God, as they are the worship leaders, and they still have to beg and plead while working, while leading the people for their inheritance? This reminds me of gentrification. This reminds me of war. How do we adequately interpret this text when we in today's world are calling for basic inheritances, freedom of speech, ceasefire, and the right to be human?
Joshua chapter 22. We've got some drama. Everyone's getting settled into their new land. Well, not the people whose land it was prior to all the killing and occupation, but you know what I mean. And 3 of the tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh, were ready to head east back to the Jordan River to their land. These tribes had this idea back in Numbers chapter 32, and they worked out a deal with Moses and the other tribes. And so now they're headed home, and the first thing they do when they cross the river is they build a huge altar. And this causes a bit of drama. All the tribes on the west side of the Jordan, who are now referred to as the Israelites, send the priest because there's only supposed to be one altar. Making sacrifices anywhere else is off limits. They even reference the sin at Peor that we read about back in Numbers 25. That's an interesting one. And the three eastern tribes try and explain, saying they're not going to use the giant altar for any sacrifices, but just as a witness, a way to remember their connection to the other tribes and all that God has done for them. But really, was that the original plan, or is that just how they reworked the idea to ease the tension and calm the drama?
Joshua 23. In this chapter, Joshua summoned all of Israel, their elders and their heads, their judges and officers, all to tell them, I am old. This was in a time long after God had granted Israel rest from all of its enemies. Like many others who are well advanced in years, Joshua is concerned with the security of his legacy. Simply put, he wants the people of Israel to keep the covenant with the Lord. Joshua reminds the people that God has won countless wars for the sake of Israel, allotting an inheritance of nations from the Jordan to the great sea of the west, under the condition that Israel stays true to the law that is written in the book of Revelation of Moses. The people must stay faithful by resisting the ways of other nations and not bowing to their gods. Most importantly, be careful to love God. For all the good things that God promised concerning God's people have been fulfilled. So breaking the covenant will bring bad things, destroying all from the good land that God provided.
Joshua chapter 24. Before the death of Joshua, the people are reminded of how far they've come. And more importantly, who was with them along the journey. Remember Abraham and Sarah? God was there. Remember Isaac and Rebekah's children, Esau and Jacob? God was there. Remember Moses' mother and his sister Miriam and their dilemmas while enslaved? God was there. Remember Moses leading the Hebrew people out of enslavement in Egypt? God was there. Through war, battle, and heartbreak, God was there. This text describes a lot of killing to God, which is problematic. It helps me to think about God being present then and now. A loving God of original blessing that has been there in the chaos from the very start. That is a God worth worshiping. That is a God worthy of covenant. Joshua says, as for me and my household, we will serve God. You are here today, living. Whatever struggles you've been through, you've made it to this point. How has God been present for you? What might covenant with God look like at this point in your journey?